audience about the prison camp years. And how that came about, and from 1859, 1860 to 1865.
Some years ago, I was reminded by our hostess, it was 14 or 15 years ago, I came up to Yawhuts and gave a talk. And I don't remember what I talked about. I might have mentioned Amanda, but anyway, Amanda's trail seemed to be born about that time. And I knew nothing about this until just recently, about a month and a half ago. And I was glad that it caught on and that people realized that this was sort of a prison camp for our people up here, and if there was a lady named Amanda that was connected with this trail. So I'll have to go back a little bit about Amanda. Now, in 1856, the Rogue River War started, and the people down in Coos Bay were afraid that the local Indians were going to get involved. So they rounded them up for a while and then sent them up to the mouth of the Umpqua River. And they stayed there about 4 years. And then they were taken on up here to Yawhuts. Now, not all the Indians were rounded up at the time. Some were able to escape into the woods, and so they stayed around on the bay, and some of the Indian women married a white man, which made them so that they didn't have to come to the reservation. But an unmarried woman living with a white man, if she was caught, had to come. And this is what happened to Amanda. In 1864, on one of the sweeps that came down the coast from an army post up the coast here, and the reason we happen to know this story is because a soldier by the name of Royal Bensel wrote a book, and he told the story about this. And they came down to Coos Bay and rounded up around 30 Indians. And then they went up Coos River to a place where a man by the name of DeCoos lived. And DeCoos was living with an Indian woman and had an 8-year-old daughter named Julia. Well, as she was not married to DeCoos, she was taken away, and the 8-year-old Julia was left there. I first read this story back in the early 1990s. And that's about all there was to the story. So I had other things to work on, so I had forgotten all about it till recently. And then, of course, you have to remember back in the early 1990s, it was harder to do research work than it is now. You can get on a computer and find almost anything. And so this is what finally happened with Amanda. And I got busy on that to try to find out what happened to Amanda. Although I knew there was going to be a dead end, because she came up here and the story is that she was barefooted apparently and walking across the rocks till she left a bloody trail and was taken up here to Yawhuts, and that's the last that we ever heard of her. And I'm sure that she died up here, and of course there's no record of that because the agent up here didn't keep any records of who died. He didn't have, well, there was never any names mentioned either. There was several censuses taken, and that's about all we know about it. So there was no way to find out for sure about Amanda, but there was the daughter she left behind, Julia, who was 8 years old at the time. And I just didn't think that I'd be able to find anything about Julia. But then I got to looking in the census records, well, actually I was looking for DeCoos, her father. I thought that she might be with him. Although in the meantime, and I'm kind of stray a little bit here, but to tell you about the problems and that go with doing research. When I was in Coos Bay there, after we had been up here and I learned all this, I got a rumor that the Coos had raped his daughter. And so I tried to trace that down, and I heard that he was taken to Roseburg for trial. Well, I called up Roseburg and gave him the name, and the lady up there that I talked to thought she recognized the name. And I said, well, that's strange. How did you happen to recognize that name? And she said, well, Dr. Beckham was in here. Well, Dr. Beckham was out of the state at that time, so I couldn't call him. So anyway, I was working on the theory that the girl had been raped by her father, and I was trying to trace him down to see what happened. And I looked in the records and never found anything. He was not on the 1860 census. It was, well, you know, it's 1864 when this happened down there. He was on the 1870 census, 1880 census, and said he was married, although there was no woman in the house. In 1890, there was no census, so I couldn't check that. And I checked the 1900 census and couldn't find his name, assuming he died. So I looked in the records for a death, and I couldn't find anything on it. Well, about that time, Dr. Beckham came back to Oregon, so I called him up. And I said, how come you were looking for the Coos? And he said, well, I wasn't. He said, it was loose. So the lady out there got the name mixed up with the Coos and loose. Well, loose, I'll talk about loose in a few minutes. So I went back and started searching again, and the Coos was a dead end. So then I started checking loose, because it was another story in Coos Bay that happened about the time that Julia was taken away from her mother. And what happened was a fellow by the name of Luce and another fellow who raped an Indian girl. Well, it turns out that from this Indian girl there was a baby, and they called him, his name was Jasper, and it's Jap for short. So I'd heard of Jasper Luce, and his half-brother started the first newspaper in Coos Bay. So then I went looking for Jasper Luce as to what happened to him. And then I noticed that he was living in a family with, and one of the person's name was Julia, although she was way too young to be the Julia I was looking after. But then I kept working, and I found that there was a Julia de Coos in 1870, working as a domestic for somebody. Then I started checking in 1980, and I didn't, excuse me, I'm on 1990s. So if I slip into that, let me know again. Anyway, let's see, it was 1870 she was there, 1880 I couldn't find her on the census. 1900 I discovered Jasper Lewis was married to a Julia. And there was 3 or 4 Julias in Coos Bay, but the one he married was the only one that matched up closely with her birth date. So we don't know for sure, but we think that Jasper married the Julia that we were talking about originally.